Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm good morning to Parag. We'd like to welcome the extended audience to this very interesting conversation uh, between startups, small and big, and investors. Uh, the intent is very straightforward and a very simple one. We have often, all of us, participated in many conversations in which either VCs or angel funds are talking about what they look for in projects and how they make up their mind on what is good for projects, what is not good for projects. And sometimes there are questions from startups who really don't understand the nuances, the need, and the impact that a VC can bring. However, this one is structured slightly differently. Uh, this is carefully curated for strong startups, and therefore this then becomes an interesting point to briefly introduce the participants. I'll start with the startups. We have Kapil Advani representing Alma Shines, startup since 2015, 2016. They started up in the field of providing services for connecting alumni with institutions so that not only could money be raised by the institutions, but also jobs, internships, and a multifaceted relationship start off. In a few short years, they've become the country's leading platform for alumni connections. We have Himmat Singh, who has been through all of these are uh, journeymen with iCreate. We're very, very proud of all of them. Himmat Singh has also had a very long journey with us, and he's created a very interesting business around cleaning solar panels in large grid connected power plants without using too much water. So he optimizes on the use of water and creates a system that cleans panels. So he offers that as a solution. Siddharth Gangal, very bright team, got together, used some very clever bit of software, some of it AI driven, some of it not, uh, to simplify the business of creating feasibilities for installation of solar panels, rooftop solar, and now they are moving into large grid connected solar also. But their secret sauce is that what a team of designers does in maybe half a day or 6 7 hours, their software does in less than 30 minutes. It's software as a service. They know no boundaries, and they're scaling up globally. And of course, we have Mr. Suraj Rajan, our great business person. He has created a very interesting business around using IoT based solutions and communications to create safety gear for workers in hazardous conditions and related services around that, building on the IoT platform. What is interesting is that for all four of them are in a slightly different point in their journey to monetization. All of them are in the market, all of them on revenue. Some of them have engaged with the formal investor community, some of them have yet to. All of them have their own set of queries, concerns, worries, anxieties. To guide them through this conversation is my chief mentor, iCreate's chief mentor, one of the founders of iCreate, Mr. Parag Amin. Don't call him sir, don't call him Mr. Just Parag is fine. He's joined us early in the morning from Philadelphia in the US. He is truly fundamentally a great innovator and an entrepreneur. So he's been in lots of spaces as entrepreneurs, from hospitality to fintech to IoT based solutions, billing solutions. Fintech, I think, is closest to his heart and has earned him a decent sum of money in the US. So he brings the successful entrepreneur perspective. And finally, the person who's really representing money, shall we say, is Mr. Kshitij Shah. Kshitij is an engineer, a techie who spent quite a few years in the Silicon Valley working and promoting startups. And then he came to India and he works in 341 Capital. And he's now in a hardcore investment role. He explores, he understands startups and he invests. But it's not just a cold blooded investment role, it's more of an evangelization role. It's more of understanding the insecurities, fears, worries of startups and then guiding them through because he's been through the journey. So at this point, I'll just say one thing to the audience that we are hoping this will be a participative session. Please feel free to write your questions into the chat box and they will be attended to and answered. And I'd like to now hand it over to Parag to take it forward.
Thank you, Anupam, so much. And thank you to all the participants that have taken out their time to join this session. Hopefully you get some significant, valuable insights out of this 1 hour of debate. Kshitij, I think this session more or less is a fireside chat with him, but it's a well-curated fireside chat because we have people that have traversed the journey, and it's not just a loosey-goosey question and answer session. It's a truly an engagement session. But the value that you startups in India really should be looking for from a VC is what you should be asking Kshitij about, right? He's got money, he's got other companies to choose from. The field is quite wide. And a lot of VC. By the way, I think him and both of his principals, startups at his the founders at his fund are all from the US. It's not just only him, and you all work together, right? So the chemistry is very strong. Their understanding as a team of who they want to invest in is in harmony, is in sync. So a lot of times, a lot of VC firms are specialized and their domain knowledge is where they want to take risk. And then they'll partner with other firms if it is a company that's outside their realm of knowledge. But that doesn't mean they won't fund you, right? They might not be the principal, they might not be the sole entity that steps in, but they'll pari passu invest with somebody else, they'll bring other funds. Sometimes they'll even bluntly tell you, you're not VC ready. Go find angel money, go find bank loans, right? So an entrepreneur must know that they have more than one option to raise money. And it's not just the bank, it's not just the VC, and it's not just getting listed, right? There's a lot of transitionary steps. So these are the kind of questions that we should be posing towards Kshitij and trying to get his expertise on it, right? I'll interject here and there where I feel that I can add more value, but this is more his show and the show of the startups and the people that are on the chat for you guys to get a lot of times the biggest challenge in my opinion, and this could be wrong as a broad statement, VCs are like chameleons. They're very tough to get because their time is, they have more money than they have time, right? A lot of times they just don't have time because that's what, if you guys watch Shark Tank, you would know this is what they deal with on a daily basis. There's like 1,000 ideas being pitched at them and they have to decide where to put money. And every entrepreneur thinks that their idea is the next best thing to sliced bread, right? But is it truly next best thing to sliced bread? And a VC is not empathetic about your cause. He may or she may be to a little degree, but primarily they're in it to make money, right? If they don't see their rupee or their dollar grow, the excitement in what you're doing is next to minimum. It's none. Doesn't matter how really awesome your cause is. They'll send you to a social VC saying there are people that specialize in that. But there are a lot of VCs that are in it to make good money. And they want an exit more than you want an exit because that's how they make money, right? They want to take you to that next level and get you the next round so that they get to cash in on some of their gains. With that, Kshitij, I'll leave it to you. And I think at the tail end of this conversation, we want to kind of tailor it to say that, or maybe it's another session with you at a later point, is what happens to raise, what's the journey of raising the second or the third round, right? Right now, all the startups, at least from the iCreate perspective, that are on the table are trying to raise their first round. But a lot of times, and Kshitij can very well relate to this, Edcast has raised several rounds of money. And the principal of EdCast is also our advisory board member on iCreate, Karl Mehta, and he's struggling to raise money. Why? Because he's in EdTech. And I was an advisor on his board, and I had told him, dude, I think EdTech is not where the money is. You got to think about something else, right? Or try to pivot a little bit so that you're not too university focused. But anyways, with that, I'll turn it over to Kshitij for him to kind of give you a very broad picture, and then we can start honing into individual issues, concerns, and topics. Over to you.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you so much, Parag. That was, you covered a lot of ground. Anupam, thank you so much for the general introduction. And the entire iCreate team, thank you so much for inviting me here. Folks, today, Himmat, Suraj, Kapil, Siddharth, I'm looking forward to kind of just engaging with you very, very deeply, right? But I think, Parag made a very important point, and let me just add a slight bit of color to it, right? And I'll try and make it engaging with you guys as well. The business of venture capital is about capital productivity, right? Please understand this. Please understand the person who is sitting opposite to you. When you think about a raise, the business of venture capital is about capital productivity. When you think about capital productivity, you don't think about different asset classes, right? So right from government sovereign bonds to gold, to FDs, to mutual funds, to private market equities, to public market equities, and so on and so forth. Every asset class traditionally has a expected rate of return, right, based on historical performance. Today, if you think about longest term asset classes, Berkshire Hathaway, of course, stands out. On certain years, they have averaged between 17 and 18% over the decades of performance that they have had in CAGR. More often than not, they have been between 20 and 22% as well, right? So when you think about the masters of capital productivity, Berkshire Hathaway, of course, can be considered in that league. That is the benchmark, right? Then you add the angle of liquidity, right? So Berkshire Hathaway primarily holds liquid stock, public market equities in most cases. A high percentage of their portfolio liquidity is available openly, right? You add the risk of holding private equity, which is far less liquid, right, in the markets that we're talking about. So for example, all startup equity is unlisted private equity, right? And you add the risk component to it. So capital productivity then demands a higher amount of return for the amount of risk that you're taking, right? So from a VC asset class, expectations can be anywhere between 25 to 30% in terms of CAGR over the 10-year period, right? Let me quickly put that in the perspective of numbers when you're raising capital, right? Why is this important for you to understand? This is important for you to understand how whatever you're pitching, right? The business model, the returns, how much your business will grow, by what scale will your business grow. You have to understand what is the responsible of a fund manager in venture capital as well, right? And that will give you a very clear perspective. So I think open question very quickly to Suraj, Himmat, Kapil or Siddharth, right? If I'm investing 100 million, right? Or let's say 100 crores for the sake of simple math, over 10 years, and let's assume my CAGR expected is about 25%, right? How much do you think that 100 crores has to be for me to deliver 25% CAGR to my investor?
Maybe 10 times, like 3.
Okay.
I think 3x in a period of 3 years, you should get maybe around, maybe around 50% of the return. So I think maybe 10 times of that.
So about 10x, right? You're saying general thumb rule is 10x, right? So if I make about 1,000 crores, that is what I am returning at 25% or close to 25% CAGR over 10 years to my investors, right? Yeah. So that's exactly the ballpark, right? Now, add in the perspective, right? VC power law. Venture capital is also a business of power laws, right? Everybody knows, statistics say that 8 out of 10 investments in venture capital, because they are high risk, will only end up returning probably the principal money or a little over above that, right? That's well known. All of us understand that. And two companies out of 10 are responsible not just to return the entire principal, but also to return the other 9x that we are talking about today, right? So another 900 crores, right? Now at max, any institutional investor in over 10 years, subsequent rounds of funding and so on and so forth, is going to probably hold about 10%. I'm picking these numbers just for the sake of simple math, right? Not necessarily, but will hold about 10%, right? So if the fund managers 10%, and let's divide the 900 crore responsibility roughly into 450 crores, right? Roughly divided by 2. Again, see, simple math, rounded off to 500 CR, right? So if 10% of a company's equity that a venture cap fund is holding has to result into returning 500 CR, right? What does your revenue need to be? Or first of all, your market cap or your valuation is going to be into 10, right? Very straightforward, right? So that's, if the 10% is worth 500, right? The market cap of the company is worth 5,000, right? How does the market cap of a company become 5,000, right? It's not accurate, but think of it thumb of rule. Thumb of rule, all of us are aware about PE multiples in the public markets, right? Take a sector that is closest to your business and see what is the PE multiple for some of the best businesses in that sector, right? Apply that multiple to your revenue. So even if you apply a 10x multiple to revenue, at 5,000 crores, you will need to have 500 crores in revenue, right? Now put all of that into perspective. And now let's come to the table together mutually to discuss how do we do a pitch to satisfy a fund manager's obligations. Fiduciary, these are my fiduciary obligations as a fund manager, right? To satisfy a fund manager's fiduciary obligations, give him confidence and conviction that the business that you are building in 0 to 10 years will become 500 crores of revenue, 5,000 crores of valuation, and thus is an exciting bet to take, right? So if I've just taken what Parag has said, put some numbers into it, put an additional flavor into it, broken it down of how a fund manager opposite to you is thinking, right? And I think that is important to understand. Parag also mentioned different times of the companies, different life cycles, different stages of the company, there are different sources of capital that are available to you, right? The same way that we did a breakdown exercise for venture capital as an asset class, which is available to you as a resource for you to grow your company, has return expectations of 25%. Venture debt, which is an adjacent capital class, which is very emerging and become very popular in the last couple of years, especially in the Indian startup capital ecosystem, has a different range of return, right? But of course, a much shorter time frame, and different VD firms have different products that can help you on a cash flow basis and so on and so forth. Same way, bank debt, the most common form of capital that we are used to working with, has a different range of return. They come in long term, but they can't do cash flow lending, right? They're still heavily set in terms of collateral based lending in terms of assets. Whereas the reality of every new company that we are building is that it's going to be very asset light, right? They are going to be digitally enabled or digital first, and they're going to be asset light, right? And operationally heavy. So that becomes kind of a mismatch. And then, of course, there is family office investors, there is angel investors, right? And after you cross VC investments, you come to PE, right? So that's a gradual, and of course, PE has similar expectations to VC. But before VC or PE, you might be thinking about family office investments and angel office investments, right? Now, there is one more flavor of capital resources available that are corporate investors, what we usually call the CVCs, corporate venture capital arms, right? There needs to be a strategic fit, right? And you need to understand their requirements as well. Most corporate venture capital arms are not so concerned about percentage returns on capital productivity. They are more looking for strategic fit on how it establishes, creates a moat around their existing businesses, helps them capture new areas of market, and help them establish a stronger, deeper penetration into their existing customers with different go-to-market strategies, right? That is where capital productivity plays a secondary role in terms of their decision. Coming to angel and family office investments, they will be very similar. They will be very long-term, right? They have the flexibility of putting a timeline as per their comfort in most cases, right? Except that some of these family offices also have professional fund managers, in which case they do bring in the discipline of the timeline, right? But that discipline of the timeline is by choice, right? And if you're working with a family office manager as well, who is a professional fund manager, you should be very clear whether they have a disciplined timeline or not, and what is the timeline that they're looking at. In India, all venture capital funds are classified as SEBI registered Cat 1 AIFs, right? Which means at the time that we start an investment vehicle, our investment vehicle timeline is predetermined, right? So if you think about on an average, a 8 to 10 year timeline investment fund, if the fund is investing in its first year, it will mostly deploy most of its funds between year 1 and year 3. It will keep a very large incubation period between year 3 and year 8 and start figuring out exits between year 8 and year 10, right? That's how you need to understand. But you also need to be conscious, are you stepping into the life cycle of the investment vehicle in year 1 or year 3? Because that essentially means their exit period is not going to be moving, right? And they will start figuring out exits starting year 8. So it doesn't matter whether you entered year 1 or year 3, your business has to grow in a timeline when you know when most of your investors are expecting return, and how are you transitioning different sets of investors as well. Within venture capital, there is early stage, which is where we focus on at 314. There's early stage, there is mid stage, and there is growth stage, right? And these are very different check sizes, and these are very fairly intuitive as well, right? Between growth stage and private equity, there's a lot of overlap today in the Indian startup ecosystem, right? And of course, there are a lot of large PE style investors that are participating in early stage as well. The most common one today in the market being Tiger, right? Tiger Global being a very prominent, very active investor in the Indian startup global ecosystem. So that kind of shows you an entire landscape of types of capital that is available to you, the types of capital productivity that is demanded from each kind of asset class, right? And for you to think about at which life stage of the company, which kind of capital you should seek out, right? With what kind of expectations. And I think with that, I would love to kind of open it up to questions to kind of dive deeper into some of these areas as well.
So why don't one of four of you, Suraj, let's start with you. If you have a specific question that can be addressed to Kshitij, please go ahead.
Yeah. So Sudhir, I just wanted to know, like, how has the pandemic changed the VC cycle? So mobility, retail, maybe travel, they're affected, these startups. So has the pandemic, like, done some kind of a bias towards the startups that VCs are now investing?
Pandemic has changed certain focus areas, but not so much, right? And I'll tell you where and how. It's not about so much the business model of the company itself. It's about understanding how consumer behavior has changed, right? So, for example, in EdTech, we have observed that we track something called income or spend elasticity, right? Families today spend a higher amount of money on education, which is not elastic. They will not reallocate that spend to anything else than they do on healthcare today as well, right? So for a general family of 4, mother, father, and 2 kids, right? A large amount of that sum is allocated to EdTech. And that has not changed. That has even become larger of that pie, right? We create frameworks, for example, in consumer spending. How much are you going to spend on travel, right? And I think there is a lot of speculation, and some of it is true, that travel budgets, though constrained, will bounce back very, very quickly, right? Because there is this pent up energy of moving to different places. And I think that is true, right? So when it opens up and when it bounces back, it will bounce back very, 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 very fast. In terms of mobility, that has definitely been affected, right? But then the question becomes, for example, we are investors in a company called Julu, which is focused on e-bikes, right? Has some small presence in Ahmedabad. They have now found a extremely new market. Instead of focusing on commuters in highly dense cities, to power the growth of the likes of Swiggy's and Zomato's, because their carbon footprint is growing, right? If any or one of you is a user of Zomato, you will see in the last few months their extreme focus on becoming carbon conscious, right? With every delivery, they're ensuring their carbon footprint is lower. They're buying carbon credits. They're becoming climate conscious. They're informing their users that there is a cost, a carbon cost, neutrality cost that is attached to kind of running their business as well, right? And that is where they want to adopt larger and larger parts of their fleets, delivery fleets, to be EVs, right? And EVs are very well positioned to cover 3 to 5 kilometers in the delivery radius, right? That is usually there for such companies, right? So we see a lot of that focus coming in very, very quickly, and mobility has quickly shifted, right? So I think it is about, one, demonstrating resilience, that whenever, and look, folks, let's be honest, pandemic is a anomaly for sure, at a scale that we have not experienced before for sure. But in general, when you look at anomalies occurring in markets, right, financial or otherwise, there's always been anomalies in 3 to 5 year cycles, right? As a business, you have to be resilient to pivot to what market demands and where you fit, right? Pivot is a overused, I think it's not a well understood term. Pivot is not a bad thing, right? But too many pivots in a very short period of time, which it also means you're not able to find a product market fit, right? So you need to be very conscious of what your reasons to pivot are. Use a very data-led approach in terms of seeking validation from the market, and then kind of going forward from that, right? So Suraj, that was a kind of a long way to answer your question, but the focus areas for us, for example, at 314 throughout the pandemic have not changed at all, right? We still focus on direct-to-consumer brands, media and content companies, enterprise technology, fintech, and some very selective deep technology brands, right? And our portfolio has withstood the mix of companies that we have in all these 5 focus areas, and all of these businesses have been extremely resilient.
So I want to add 2 things to what you just said. For in the circus of entrepreneurship, right? Who do you think is the magician? It's not the VC, and it's not the entrepreneur. The magician is your customer, right? Flat out, the magician is your customer. So keep that in your mind, at the forefront of your thought process, that you're not building this to suffice your needs or your venture capital's needs or your investors' needs or whoever. Whatever you're doing it to suffice the need of your customer. Uber Eats didn't see, they were not magicians themselves. They didn't see that a pandemic was coming. They saw a revenue model to kind of offer a service to their customers above and beyond transport. But when a situation like a pandemic hit, that thought process that they had at the forefront of their mind, that how do I offer something else to my customers, suddenly became the most viable business product. Every VC firm now looks at it, or every investor now looks at it and says, oh my God, right? So that's one. And the second is, in adversity lies opportunity. So even if you didn't start Uber Eats then, why would you not start it now? If you were an Uber-like company, right? So I'll give you my example. A year and a half ago, 2 years ago, we started a payment process, which there is none that exists anywhere. It was using payment over Bluetooth instead of NFC. Why did we do it? We did it for completely different reasons. Because we have, my customer is Carnival Cruise Lines. We have a captive market, a very large captive market, and a very transient market. So every ship has 3,000 guests and 2,000 crew members, 5,000 people that we bring into a port of call every week, and we control their purse, right? So the reason we built a solution was, I walk into a store and somebody says, hey, Parag, welcome from the Diamond Princess. That blows me away. That experience doesn't exist today. without me doing anything, without me pulling out my ID, without me doing nothing. I just walked into that store. My picture popped up on somebody's tablet and they're addressing me by my first name. They know a little about me. They're engaging with me because they do that today. They go and say, what's your name? Oh, my name is Parag. And then they engage with you. Hey, Parag, this, that, and this, that. All we did is personalize that to a level, and you have the option of not being spooked. So you can say, I don't want to be in this program. That's okay. But we don't have a single person that doesn't want to be in this program because we give a lot of stuff back to you when you engage in our model, right? The point I'm trying to make is in adversity lies opportunity and the customer is the magician, right? Let's keep those two things in mind. And then the VCs will love you because that's the music that they want to hear. Everything else is noise. Because you as a management team is not going to be able to grow your revenues. Your customers are going to grow your revenues. Sitting behind a desk, you're not going to be able to grow your revenues, right? Himmat?
Yeah, thank you, Parag. Yeah, hi Sitish and everyone. So Sitish, I have some queries regarding the post-offer process, like how it works, the due diligence and the financial mapping of the traction and the projections. So if I again put my questions in the format, the first thing is that what does investors do after in the process of due diligence, like, and what can be the reasons for reversing that decision during the due diligence?
Okay, so let me just rephrase your question. What does due diligence look like behind the scenes for an investor,
yeah, exactly.
right? And what are things that an investor might find out that might lead to a reversal of a positive investment decision, right? So before they start due diligence, they might have offered you a term sheet, but they might take back the term sheet or change terms on the term sheet based on what they find in due diligence. Correct?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, fantastic. So the due diligence, in short, is a process of validation of everything of your conviction of the business model, translating into numbers, right? And identifying basically how many levels of control you have in a business. Make sense? Right? Let me give you an example. Let's take fintech, right? Now, if you take fintech and you're building a new fintech company, one of the ways that you're going to monetize is percentage cost of transaction, right? If you're a payment gateway or you're in addition and so on and so forth. But if you identify that as a lever, right, you need to build number of transactions, gross volume of transactions, average ticket size of transactions, and then payment method of transactions, right? Let's dive deeper into that. How many variables within this do you control? Right? So for example, regulation in India now mandates that you have to have some kind of UPI integration, which is also much preferred, right? UPI is almost at zero cost. So then your entire revenue opportunity, if your business model is solely dependent on percentage transaction cost, is taken away because of UPI, right? And more in such areas, depending on the nature of business, right, we have risks that are known directionally, not exactly, but are known directionally, right? So these are the risks that during the due diligence process, we want to discuss with you, that if this happens, how do you get back a revenue generating business model then in that case, right? Will customers pay a fixed fee for integrating your payment gateway, for example, or having a fintech type integration, making your payment or checkout easier? Will you reduce cart abandonment rates? Will you increase conversion rates? Will you offer a buy now, pay later solution, right? Which offers fixed installments depending on credit underwriting and so on and so forth, right? So where will you then additionally generate revenue? That becomes the question, right? So during the due diligence phase, this is what we're looking to map. Secondly, we're looking to map also the operational expertise of the founders, right? I think for investors, it's a clear, the level of detail you can reach in your due diligence, financial projection clearly shows how much deeply you have thought about inputs to your business, right? And how mature you are as an operator, right? It's not a determination signal, right? So for example, at 314, we don't take it as a decision-making signal, but we take it as a very important signal that what is, as soon as we quickly come in, what is we need to help you fix, right? So if you're a non-financial founder, if you've not done before, if you're a first-time founder, we want to get you one of a good CFO firms who can act as your CFO, right? Can build the financial projections for you, can manage the expenses for you, can give you thresholds and controls, right? Can monitor your debtor aging, right? Sometimes we bring up the question in your nature of business, for example, if you're dealing with enterprises have a long payment cycle. So even if on paper you have 30 days, they will not pay you realistically between 45 to 60 days. When that happens, it creates cash flow pressure. If cash flow pressure gets created, then you have collections pressure, right? So it helps us understand that, okay, this is a capability that we will need to help you build very, very quickly. While you will be good at building the product and going and selling to the enterprise market, right? We need to bring in a professional to help manage data aging, right? That is what happens. Together through this process, we need to mutually build conviction, right? But if there is a gap that we can't reconcile on, right? For example, the business model says that percentage transaction is the only way the consumer will pay for this, right? And we are bullish on our kind of sentiment based on our network and what we understand from the macro, what we understand from the regulators, that UPI is going to eat away at this, right? And we don't have any alternatives after mutual discussion. That might lead to a change of decision, right? That is one of the ways that financial projections provide clarity in terms of conviction on how operationally intensive the entire business is. Another thing that happens more often than not that you realize, you probably estimated let's assume you needed $2 million or $3 million, right? To achieve $15 million, or let's say $3 million invested over 18 months to achieve 1 million ARR, right? One of the reasonable goals that startups will have, especially if you're a SaaS startup, especially if you're selling SaaS to enterprise, right? Debtor aging will come into picture in terms of cash flow management, right? Because if you've built a pipeline, if you service the pipeline, and if your cash flow management is not correct, by the end of 18 months, you will not be able to just service your existing customers. So we start a discussion with you. You think you need 3 million, right? Why don't you raise $1 million extra so that it provides you that buffer? The opposite is also true, right? You might probably have projected to raise more money, but then you might need lesser for that revenue goal, right? So the opposite is also true. And we want to kind of then adjust with you on that as well, right? So that helps us set the AOP with you, which is generally the practice of annual operating plans, which is much more directional in nature, just very high level outline number, right? And then we reconcile with the AOP every quarter with you during our analysis call, right? So that is how due diligence impacts, right? And due diligence also helps us understand from a financial metrics perspective, which are the things that we would like to monitor with you on a month-to-month basis as your business grows, right? I'm very privileged to work with some of the best operators and people in the country, right? And one of the people that I'm privileged to work with is, of course, Mr. Mohandas Pai, right? He has instilled a operational discipline in not only us, but all companies that we work with, because the precedence is kind of set by his operational discipline with Mr. Murthy at Infosys. At Infosys scale, they could get an MIS out before the 5th of every month. Before the 5th of every month. Any promoter that I talk to today cannot get their MIS out before the 15th of their month. Right? This is the operational strength that we are talking about. As a startup, 90% of your costs are projected and predicted. There's not much variance. 10% there is variance, right? And you can fix that very, very quickly. But for the previous month's operation, if you take 15 days to do the analysis, what fixes you need to make is probably a month late. That cascades in terms of cash flow management. right? So building that operational discipline, irrespective of what nature of business you're in, is extremely important. And we work with you collaboratively, depending on your nature of business, to help you identify that.
I have one more additional question.
Yeah.
This one. So how do you map the financial projection with the traction? And if I talk about the initial stage, earlier startups, so we are having kind of LOIs other than the revenues. And so what kind of significance LOIs are having in the traction?
Sorry, I couldn't get the last word. You're saying how does it map to traction?
Yeah, so I said like what kind of significance LOIs, letter of intents, are having in the traction?
Yeah, in traction.
Yeah.
I think they have a very positive influence, right? LOIs are extremely important because those are the businesses that are ready to work with you, right? Then two things impact traction. How quickly are you able to convert the LOIs into real business, right? And how much is a capital investment from your side to get that conversion going, right? And how quickly does your ROI cycle start, right? So if your deployment time is too long, right, then you're making it too long. That helps us understand also your pricing and offering, right? So the customers are not going to pay before delivery, right? So how do you manage that gap between the LOI and the delivery in terms of cash flow? Helps us understand how you're going to utilize the money, where it's going to go. Of course, it's going to go into working capital, but is it going to be enough? And what are the risks of delivery as well? So that helps us understand how much buffer is going to be, right? But having LOIs, having a good pipeline of LOIs, and consequently having LOIs which are larger and larger in nature is very, very good, right? That helps you build capacity very, very quickly, both from a capital and a resource perspective.
So Kapil, let's go over to you. And one quick note while we are in between questions. I only see there's one question posted on the chat. So although we had allocated Avni 15 minutes to Q&A, I would like to reclaim some of that time back. I think this engagement with Kshitij is it's very engaging and it's very productive. So let's go down that path. And you can probably take the questions after the session if need be, since there's only one. So go ahead, Kapil, what's your concern of the day?
So many of the times we see that, okay, some markets are booming, like in COVID times, tech markets were booming, sometimes e-commerce was booming, sometimes techs are booming. So how does that boom happen? How does one keep a track of it? How can one capitalize on it? Like being an entrepreneur, or what's the thought process that goes an investor side? Because certainly it's more like the investment power that kind of adds up to the boom, not solely, but it has a contribution to it. So yeah, if you could throw some light, like how do markets evolve with the investor support, and how does the synergy work?
Yeah, maybe Parag, I would love for you to jump in here as well. But couple of very simple answers is the market is the market is the market, right? And that's to say that even us as investors can't predict accurately where the market is flowing, right? What we have the benefit of is working with our peers to understand, shift in positions, what we are seeing, and so on and so forth, right? And that gives us early signal indicators in terms of what might be coming up next. But again, that's why we call the way we invest, the entire framework that we invest, we call it a thesis, because the thesis can be right or wrong, right? We don't call it a prophecy. If it was going to be right, we would have called it a prophecy, right? So the thesis can be right or wrong. We work with our network. We heavily depend on the people within our network, our LP network, the co-investors that we work with, the future investors that we work with, right? And the companies all together to draw signals of where probably directionally the market is going to go, right? But in the absence of a network, and that is also by the way, a good advantage of sharing signals with you in real time is what a good VC does for you, right? That is actually, you should expect that from a good angel investor as well, right? And that is just a simple way of drawing signals, right? But there's no clear answer to study evolution of the market, to be honest. But what are your opinions on this?
Yeah, so see, Kshitij brought the VC perspective to the table. I'll try to bring a little bit of the entrepreneurial perspective to the table, right? So one thing, regardless of what, like I said, in adversity lies opportunity, but we should not be adversity driven. We should be more opportunity driven, right? And in there, we just have to find, you don't go and reshape yourself as a company because of COVID, because like it or not, COVID is a timed event. There is still a lot of unknown whether this event is going to be a year long, 2 years long, 3 years long. And here's the reality of the fact. As soon as people stop dying, it's a non-event. It's a flu, right? So, and if the medical community is not able to predict it, how will you? So set that aside. Don't see that as a roadblock or an opportunity or whatever. But just the companies, the best and the most powerful tool in entrepreneurship is what we call the rearview mirror. You can look at what has happened and learn from it, because that's priceless. You're not paying anything for it, and you're learning from the rearview mirror. The companies that said, let's take food tech, COVID or no COVID, everybody has to eat. So that business of eating is not going away. How you eat may change, right? So first and foremost, we have to recognize that the business of eating is not going to go away. And it is going to change. So people that started packing their foods individually, restaurants that immediately pivoted to starting delivering rather than even waiting on Zomatos, that I proactively will deliver, because even Zomato was in a flux when all this started. They didn't have drivers, they didn't have people, nobody knew where to go, what not, right? Actually, I shouldn't speak about Zomatos. They might not have, I'm making that up. Uber Eats, I know for a fact, right? So not being in India, I don't know what the situation was really there. But you do really have to kind of within your space pivot. You don't just reinvent yourself as a company. Inside of your business model, how do you try to do something small enough that is large enough? Because just individually wrapping foods, that's not a challenge that cannot be overcome by the smallest lariwala or the largest restaurant, right? But that makes a huge difference in people's mindset that I'm not touching things. So and when you, sorry, Anupam, just one last thing. When you bring that sort of frugal innovation, which India is very good at, to the table, your customers love you, your investors love you, everybody loves you, right? I mean, it's just yes, Anupam, go ahead.
Perhaps there was a shade to Kapil's question, and that is that, like it or not, there is a wave, a bias that even investors carry. So if the flavor of the season was e-commerce a few years ago, then if you were in the e-commerce space, you got quickly evaluated, you were understood, and therefore the chances of your getting invested in or rejected quickly were pretty good. Now, if at that point in time you were in a completely different space, then to get traction, to get top of mind engagement with the VC community then becomes difficult. And perhaps Kapil's question might have been that if you are running contrary to a popular wave or to things which are easily understood or invested in, if you're in a space which is not getting so much investment traction.
So that's a very good point, Anupam. That's a very good point. But here's the thing. So in the solar space, let's just say, whether you're installation of solar solutions or you're cleaning of solar solutions, you have a little bit of a lull, right? So what would your investor like to see you do during that lull? You're still going to spend money. You still have payroll. You can't just shut down as a company and let all your people go. Or maybe you will have to, because if your line of business if you're a cruise line, you're really scratching your back right now. Because 18 months and you haven't generated a single dollar yet, and there's still no certainty, right? But let's talk about other businesses. That's where you start saying, what can I do right now? Because my time and money clock are still on and burning. They are not stopping. So what do? I sit down with my investor and I ask my investor that, where do you think, as my partner, as my source of capital, where do you think I should be investing my time and energy? And because they have a little better insight than you do, believe it or not, they do, because at the end of the day, it's their money. It's not just their inner drive, right? That capitalistic bug in them is not truly a bug. It's like a tarantula. It's huge. It's much bigger than yours. So they will direct you and say that, look, see if you do this, because we think this will bring you value 4 months, 5 months, 6 months down the road when you do come back, right? And Kshitij, you can add more to that minutes to kind of close it off.
No, absolutely. And I think Kapil, let me just contextualize this to something that you do, for example, Alma Shines, right? There is a very stark contrast to how universities are run in India versus how universities are run in the US, right? And I'll tell you my personal example. I'm a product of MS University. When MS University, I have felt very proud to be in MS University. By the way, we forget people who go to MS University. I don't know if some of the people in the audience have gone to MSU as well. We have the privilege of studying in a palace, a literal palace, right? Nobody has that privilege. Very few people have that privilege, right? Being a state-run school to have infrastructure access like that. Secondly, MSU is much more well capitalized in its alumni network outside of India than it is in India. In the Bay Area, the first VC I met was an MSU alumni. He talked to me about it because I was an MSU alumni. My mentor at San Jose State, who was also the advisor for the Indian State Student Organization, right, was an MSU alumni, right? And we bonded over that being MSU alumni, right? And our universities just don't know how to capitalize on an alumni network. So alumni now themselves have just taken over the responsibility that we are going to connect with the students, right? Because even as an alumni, if I want to give back very constructively to my university, right, as an alma mater, like the sense of being an alma mater and one of I don't have straightforward ways to do that. I just don't have straightforward ways to do that, right? So I think that becomes very, very important. But again, does it fit into the university funding model? Will the universities become paying clients for you? I think they've not just figured it out. It's just a very different market thing, right? You think about the same solution in the US market. They send emailers, they host events, they host dinners, they do alumni awards for successful people, right? They do a lot of these networking things, right? And they don't see direct ROI from it. But when their entrepreneurs become millionaires and billionaires, tell me the first act of philanthropy they do: donate the first $1 million back to their school, right? And that is just an entire sentiment or culture that unfortunately we're missing. And I don't think we're missing completely. There are a lot of entrepreneurs who have tried to give back in their own way, right? But it's not been a clear path for them as well, right? So when you think about that just being a business, and is that needed? There is a problem to be solved between alumni, school, and student relationship. Yes, right? But is there a paying customer there you see anywhere? I think that's a myth that we have found through a series of years, right? And we had actually funded a company in that same space. And I can tell you from practical experience that it has been tough to find a paying customer, right? And hence, they've also tried quite a few business models around monetization.
Well, Kapil, you actually picked up a few customers during COVID. So you are on the lucky side of the fence, right? I mean, did you not pick up a few customers?
Yeah, the business has been quite stabilized. Like as it was before COVID, it has been on similar growth curve. So
if there are two industries that have woken up to COVID, it's education and healthcare. Because neither they were more in-person kind of trades, right? They kind of push themselves away from saying, hey, we don't want to do this tech stuff. Now they don't have a choice now. They had to pivot, right? So they understand the power of innovation and automation a lot more now than they wanted to accept, maybe pre-COVID. So in my opinion, I think you are a little bit better positioned now from saying that engaging electronically or engaging using technology is to your benefit, because that is becoming a prevalent model for them.
Certainly, yeah.
Right. Siddharth, how about you?
You have to unmute yourself, Siddharth.
I think it's your phone that's on mute. Your PC might have been on.
Exactly. So yeah, I was asking. So we're in the SaaS for solar industry, right? So what we do is we help solar installers figure out for their prospects how much solar could be put up on the rooftops. It's in the form of a SaaS software that we sell to installers. Now,
Mhm.
for us, it's a very niche type of industry, right? It's the solar industry, and then we're focused on specific subset, which is solar installers only. So previously, like we have found like good interest from US based cores in investing into the company and or acquiring the company. But it's been harder to get interest from Indian venture capitalists. So so could you tell me like how you would look at it? Let's say that if a VC who doesn't really understand that much about the solar space uh, gets to see that, hey, someone who's in the industry, a solar company or a corporate, right? They're investing. So is that something that you look at positively, and does it change your due diligence process, or does it change your thought in any way? Because solar is not your or not anyone's sectoral expertise here.
Mhm. Sure, Siddharth. So let's do this in the benefit of the entire group, right? Let me ask you few qualifying questions, right? And that will help us arrive at building conviction together, right? At the end of the day, where us VCs don't have domain expertise, it's about building conviction together, right? So tell me, for your business, for a solar installer, what is the average cost of a project for installing a project?
The average cost for a house would be around 1.5 lakhs to
That's the
$2,000.
installation cost. So that's the
Yeah.
total project cost, or that is his margin inside?
That's the total project cost.
Okay. How much margin does he have inside it?
5 to 10%.
10%.
As
Okay.
his profit margin after
At 10%
operations.
as his, yeah. So 10% as his profit margin, right? How much percentage of, let's assume for the sake of simple math, for 1 lakh project, right? How much percentage, 10% is the profit margin. How much percent is labor and associated costs, right? So what are the gross margins looking like?
All right. I'd say around another 10% would be labor.
Okay. Where is the other 80% growing? So give me a very rough,
So
quick breakdown of that
80%.
80%.
That 80% would be the hardware cost, hardware, supply chain, getting the materials, to the site, and then 10% would be the labor cost.
Okay, so 10% net profit, 20% gross margins on the overall business. Is that a fair way to kind of summarize the business model?
Approximately, yes.
Okay. Out of that 100%, right? How much does your service cost them in terms of percentage?
Depends on the company which is buying, but anywhere from 0.2 to 0.5%, depending on customers.
And does that help them save more money or make more money?
It helps them in both. The primary thing of why we sell is that it helps them convert more customers. So the revenue top line growth is the primary reason why we sell. The second reason why we sell is that we save them time.
Okay. In the Indian market, it has always been very difficult to sell productivity, right? And that's true of not just you guys. Think about enterprise SaaS as well. It has been very difficult to sell productivity, right? People, because help is available and even training to the staff is relatively at a cheaper cost, they always think hiring 2 more people on the ground will solve their problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And that is a mindset challenge. That is not a business model challenge. So I would actually, in a subsequent call, would dive deeper with you to understand how are you going to change the mindset, operational mindset of these people, because the value proposition of the product that you're delivering is clear, right? You're delivering it at a controlled cost. It is helping them save something, but I need to understand the 0.5%, let's say the 0.5% input cost, right, is taking away from their net profit margin. So their net profit margin has come down from what you say, from 10% to 9.5%, right? How much does the profit margin go up based on that input?
That's hard for me to calculate right now.
Right. So if it's hard for you to calculate, my friend, they probably don't even have an idea how to start. Right? Given the domain expertise that you have, right? If the formula is difficult for you, right? The person on the other side probably just doesn't know how to measure productivity, what he is paying for. So by gut feeling that you're saving time for sure, right? But then how does he map the ROI? Because he can't map the ROI or quantify it. It becomes difficult for him to decide whether 0.5 is good or 0.5 is bad, or is he overspending or is he underspending, right? More often than not, you put the customer in a situation where he doesn't know himself the parameters to decide, right? You will not be able to make the sale. Because these are questions that he will never ask you, right? You lose the battle in unasked questions.
Right.
Right? So your approach, the challenge to change operational mindset, and you have to provide them the framework of quantification. If you are successful to put together your sales pitch in that order, right, then you're clearing everything up that gets in the way of a sale. Right? Then comes, as I said, in subsequent call comes the question saying, okay, how do you change? What do you make it easy? How do you operationalize the sales process? How do you make it very convenient? Right? How do you make it very process driven so that you can scale, you can hire a team and you can scale that sales process and so on and so forth. Then comes the regular question. But I hope we've arrived at some sort of conviction that we don't know how this is going to scale at this time in terms of sales.
Right. So now the question is now if and I understand that it's hard for me to do the math, so it's even harder for a person outside. So how would you look at it if a corporation decides to invest along with you? So does it solve some of your problems or some of your hesitations?
No. I think I am not looking, so, there are, again, I can't speak on behalf of the entire investing community or different VCs or things like that. When we build our investment conviction at 314, we build it individually. Anybody else joining is just icing on the cake. It will help the company grow faster, right? But today I am in the journey with you, not because somebody else has conviction, right? Me and you need to have conviction together mutually, because I have conviction in what Siddharth is saying and he'll be able to grow in that direction. Right? So our decisions are not based on convictions from other people. What helps, right? And where this is tactically important. So I gave you the strategic side of it. Where it is tactically important is if our risk modeling shows that we can only participate, for example, for 30% of your round, for 50% of your round. Right? Then having a co-investor or a lead investor already decided makes a lot of difference. But that's not to build the conviction. It's that without this sum of capital, the milestones that are needed in the next 18 to 24 months will be absolutely hard or impossible to reach. Right? That's where all investors then, kind of come together to say, okay, this is the amount of capital required. Right? But if you can achieve the same with a smaller amount of capital, then individual conviction is mostly what you will see from most of the investors.
Understood. Thanks, Kshitij. Also, in terms of revenue multiples, how do you look at licensing revenue versus subscription revenue? Is it the same? Is it different?
Again, depends completely on cash flow management, how tight you're going to be.
Okay.
Right. There will be industry analysis in terms of deals that are done closest to your sector in terms of revenue multiples is where we seek insights and guidance from as well through our internal proprietary research. But I don't think there is a clear kind of formula whether a licensing or a subscription revenue can lead to different revenue multiples.
Okay. It's a net company revenue multiple that you arrive to. Yeah. Thanks.
Sure.
Over to you,
At
Parag.
this point, do you want to kind of collate the questions that you have and shoot them over?
Yes. So Kshitij, we have one question which I think initially that you had also given was, what are the major factors to consider while choosing an early stage investor, like angel network or family office to approach to? It has come from Pranav Kapadia, who is one of the iCreate incubatee as well.
Sure, Avni. So I think it's extremely important to do your research on every investor or angel that you're approaching as well, right? And look at their non-financial value add, right? Of course, capital is the starting point, but along with that capital, right, how much are they going to help you? But it's a very slippery slope, right? And a lot of promoters or family offices, if they're just starting to invest, over a period of time, they learn how to be hands-off, right? Because it just comes from their gut feeling perspective of they're very hands-on operational promoters by the nature of the business that they are in, right? Institutional investors have a very disciplined pattern of how to be hands-off in terms of operations of their companies, right? So we have very determined, solid strategic touch points with you every month, every quarter, and so on and so forth. And then we have operational touch points with you, which are separate, right? So we don't collate the two. If you need operational help, we'll come in and help you operationally as well, right? But we'll not mix the two. And we know how to be hands-off and hands-on at both at the same time, right? So you need to understand the party on the opposite side and say, okay, this is what I'm expecting, right? In 18 months, if I hit X, Y, and Z as milestone metrics, then they can be financial or non-financial again, for all of these metrics that they're tracking, right? Will you be able to make introductions from me to X, Y, and Z again, right? They might be a potential customer. They can be a large corporate. They can be a reference. They can be a next round investor. They can be a next angel. They can be a next VC, anything, right? But I think that's a flavor of conversation that you need to have to qualify how helpful and useful this investor is also going to be down your line.
At this point, I'd just like to ask Parag if he has some final comments, and then he's got another meeting he needs to go out to.
Thank you, Anupam. I'm actually already dialed into that other call that I had at 9 o'clock, and I did tell them that I'm running late on the previous call, so that's okay. But one thing that I wanted to tell everybody that's dialed in that probably hasn't had the opportunity to engage directly with the panel. If you guys have any specific questions, please coordinate through Avni, and we will get you answers from Kshitij and maybe even from the broader investment community. The goal here is a lot of times, I think if you see your investor as your partner and kind of step into their shoes, because that's what they are doing day in and day out, right? Their sole goal is first they have to see you as a partner before they will engage with you or give you the money. But more importantly, from an entrepreneurial perspective, you have to see them as a partner. Are they the right fit, right? I mean, if you're into medical devices and that's not what Kshitij is investing in, you don't waste his time. More importantly, don't waste your time. Maybe you can ask him and say, who should I go to, right? Half the time we believe as entrepreneurs that we don't have access to these VCs is because it's like picking up a phone book and looking for a plumber when you actually need a carpenter. It's not going to get you anywhere, right? So maybe institutions like iCreate can help you. Maybe investment community can help you. At the end of the day, they want to see you succeed, right? Because they might come in with another firm that is specialized in that domain, and they see the drive in you. They see belief in your model. They'll come in along with an expert. So use those connections, tools, and somewhere along the line, I think I heard Avni tell me today morning that the general perception in India was the only way you're able to fund yourself is if you have connections to the VC. I disagree. Kshitij can give you his view. I mean, I don't know how many deals that he puts money in where somehow somebody has been personally recommended to them. I think at the end of the day, you're not giving your VC enough credit. They have a calculator, and you have to fall on the positive side of the equation on the calculator. And if you do, they love you. You could be their first cousin. If you fall on the negative side, they're not going to go anywhere near you. But with that, I would like to kind of thank Kshitij for his time, thank the panelists for being here, and over to you, Anupam.
Thanks, Parag. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Parag. Anupam, if I may just add one small perspective, right? I think, folks, when you approach a VC, and fund managers will not usually tell you this, right? When they say a no, it's not because a lot of times that your business models are not good, right? Please understand, they are building a portfolio strategy where risk balancing and risk mitigation is extremely important, right? So for example, out of the 5 focus areas that I described for you, right? If I've already invested, let's say 30% of my corpus from the investment vehicle, right, into media and content companies, you might come up to me, do the research. You've mapped me correctly, as per what Parag was saying, right? You've mapped me correctly. I've invested in media and content companies, so I do that. I've done those deals before. I've successfully done those deals before. But then after an evaluation, I come back and say, sorry, we can't take this forward, right? You have to get clarity that it's not a misfit about your business model. My portfolio allocation strategy does not allow me to exceed 30%. Right?
Brilliant.
And this is not publicly available information, right? This you will probably never be able to ask, but you have to be able to politely build a relationship with the VC on the other side and honestly ask them, is it a misfit on my business model that you see something not happening, or does this puzzle just does not fit into your grand scheme of things, right? And hence your takeaway from each kind of no that you get has to be very important. You have to be very clear why that no was, right? Because that is important to build into your feedback cycle.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And it's so real. Avni, more questions?
Kshitij, we have one more question which says, when one is building a social app like Clubhouse at the seed stage, what is the depth of clarity on the future monetization plan is required? Or a clarity and a plan for increasing KPIs like DAU, MAU is good enough? It comes from Vimal.
Yeah, I think for businesses like social media apps, I think you are in the business not for monetization first, you are in the business of capturing mind share, right? MAUs, DAUs are all metrics that are representative of mind share. And hence, for extremely early stage businesses in such areas, it is just important to define the metrics that indicate mind share from your audience. How large is the mind share, and can you sustainably grow the mind share? Right? That becomes key.
Avni, I just want to add one more thing. Little color first. My son, who's an economics major, I took him to U Chicago. I know he was not going to get in there. I know he was not good material, U Chicago material. I took him there. He was a very bright kid. The admissions director, after the sessions, he goes, Dad, why did you waste this plane ticket? Why did we come to Chicago? I know I couldn't, this is Mecca, I couldn't get in here. And then the admissions director came in and I said, this is what my son is saying. So he goes to my son, he goes, what's your GPA? What did you get in your standardized testing? Blah, 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 blah. Then he goes to my son, do you play the trumpet? And my son said, no. He said, if you played the trumpet, you have the best grades for a trumpeter, and I need 4 trumpeters this year. So if you were trying to compete to get into U Chicago on academic grounds, that year, you were not going to get in. But God willing, if you were a trumpeter, you will get in. The point I'm trying to make right now is in the US, the Biden administration is committing billions and billions of dollars to solar, to energy, broadly speaking. There will be a lot of traction and friction in that play. Or with the $3 trillion that we pumped into our economy, there was a lot of fintech play. And every VC then, even if they are not a fintech VC, or they now, just for the sex appeal, they want that 1 or 2 or 3 companies in their portfolio because they really don't know how wildly that is going to go on fire, right? Maybe you will be that fit. Maybe you will be the trumpeter of the year, but keep that in mind as well. So the antithesis of don't always go to the VC that just caters to your domain. If you truly are in a domain that's on fire, go to the other VC that's trying to get 1 or 2 of those portfolio companies. And Kshitij, your 2 cents to that. I mean, I could be way off because I'm not an investor. I'm just thinking as an opportunist here.
No, Parag. I think, the last word you mentioned is key, being an opportunist. You always have to understand, right? When I say that, VCs in the starting of the session, I said that the capital productivity demand from this asset class is close to 25%, right? Is to also say 25% is the base, right? But we're all opportunists, As much as we can push that higher, we'll do that. Right? And that we want partners who want to have that same level of ambition with us. Right? And that becomes very, very key. It was also interesting, from his personal life example, Parag mentioned, right? Not only capital allocators have a portfolio diversification strategy, universities do as well. Right? Because they're trying to create a good environment, a mixed cultural environment for you. Right? But that was just a key takeaway for me. But so you got to understand all of these aspects. And he's right? Go to a VC who does not have a similar company in our portfolio first, rather than going to a VC who already has similar companies.
Kshitij, one last question, and I would kind of love it because it's close to my heart. It belongs to the travel industry. He describes they are into niche area of customizing holiday, but they don't have an option of registering IP because the SaaS model doesn't allow it to happen. What would your views for them raising money, because they are into a very large market? A lot of players are there. They are in integrators of services. What do you think are the chances of such companies for raising money?
I think these are operationally heavy companies and business models in travel, because travel is such a disparate industry, has tremendous amount of takers of value from the entire supply chain, right? Or entire value chain, right? Everybody wants a percentage of that, right? I spent 15,000 rupees. I spent 15 lakh rupees, right? My travel agent is going to take X%. The travel flights are going to take X%. The travel aggregator for the flight booking is going to take X%, and so on and so forth. The challenge in this business has always been, as you grow your scale, your margins get thinner and thinner because you can't remove the dependency of the people that you work with in the value chain. Right? As opposed to for example, folks in EdTech. The larger your scale, the margins also grow because of the scale, right? Or at least remains constant. In travel, in a lot of ways, there is so many people across the value chain servicing, right, that it reduces over a period of time. And I think that's a fundamental friction to the travel business model. So you either have to start by just capturing a very large market share and that becoming the dominant player, and then having a business model that does not focus on profits at all. But if you try to balance both, then it's very, very difficult, right? And those are two very different stories, right? You create a story and a business plan and operations that focuses on growth versus create a balance between growth and profits. Most companies can't arrive at the same point in time, right? Don't try to do that. Don't try to do that. You prioritize. For a certain period of time, either you're going to prioritize growth or you're going to prioritize creating balancing profits, right? But if you try to do both, it's going to be a hit and miss always, because then you will have profits, but your growth will not have been sufficient, right? As opposed to your competitors, right? And then because you're small, your profit will be small in the grand scheme of things, right? So that will not add value.
I think so Kshitij, you have spoken exactly what I have been through as my entrepreneur journey. But I would just say one thing here, that in such kind of businesses, as per my experience, it worked out for me, was also family investors, family offices, and also your competitors. Like Argomni got acquired because we were sharing large market share, and they just took us up. So quick exit, larger growth, larger market capture, and that's what for this kind of sectors works the best.
Right. Yep, absolutely, Avni. That's perfectly true, right?
Yeah.
Before we begin wrapping up, we have the luxury of three of our founders with us. We have Dr. Madhu Mehta, Mr. Tyagarajan, and Professor Jaju. And I wanted to call upon them to see if they have something to share on this topic, or a question to go to Kshitij or to the larger audience. Madhu bhai?
Sorry.
Tyagi ji? Yes, sir.
Kshitij, particularly Madhu and I, over the years, when we started getting into this space of trying to encourage entrepreneurs in their early journey, uh, we were more focused on the individual or the founding team rather than the idea. In other words, we were betting on the entrepreneur rather than the enterprise, knowing fully well that enterprises may work, may not work because of several factors and other forces. But if we are able to reasonably gauge that the entrepreneur and the team have it in them, they're likely to succeed sooner or later. I just want to know that as a VC, when you're doing some early stage funding or family offices or the smaller angel investors, how much bearing does this have on them? So if they're a little iffy on the idea, I mean, they're not so sure, they kind of have a hunch that this might make it, but it may not. But they're reasonably confident that this bunch of kids have it in them to make it sooner or later. How does their mind work?
They are very willing to take educated bets based on the conviction through the interaction with the founders. So it's very similar to what you and Mr. Mehta have done during the early days, right? And I would say that still stands. But it's a very hard question that it plays an influencing role in their decision, but it's not a quantifying influencing role, to be honest, right? They will not be able to. Nobody will be able to explain how much. It's just on the energy that a person brings to the table, an energy that a person brings to the room, right? And no matter what, they will raise money, right? No matter what, they will come out of a hard situation, right? And you get a lot of these insights when you interact with people over a longer period of time. So these also can't be figured out from a single meeting, 2 meetings, or 3 meetings, right? And that's why during the due diligence process, while I was explaining, right, we sometimes take a deliberate approach of being devil's advocates, right? Because we want to, create positive environment pressure and see how the founding team behaves in that positive environment pressure as well. And that gives us a lot of clues, right? But if they just leave the thought and are not able to convince the stakeholder, right? A lot of people, for example, will always come and say, like, there are a lot of family promoter offices that I have personally interacted with. And they say, I'll often discuss deals with them and they'll say, oh, I have never made money in this area, right? They're depending on their experience, right? And then I have to go in and convince them why that is no longer the case and who else has made money. And that reflects them, that allows them to reflect on what they could have done differently from the instance that they did not make money, right? So I think, yes, that unsaid bias exists. It does play an influencing role, and that is where the energy and the passion with which you would deliver your pitch, the meetings that you have, you ask them open questions. I think one of the things that I have seen the most seasoned entrepreneurs and founders do is be very clear in understanding where the other person comes from today, right? So for example, in my case, they very clearly understand I am a fund manager and what responsibilities that I have, right? And hence they are asking me the right question, right? That clarity also helps very much. Asking the right questions to the right person at the right time.
Kshitij, first of all, congratulations for a very, very open session, because you have shared your views without any kind of sort of boundaries. Very valuable for all people who are listening, because they probably would be able to relate as to how they can get more out of a interaction with VC. Having said that, there are this 10-year time frame that generally is being talked about as a fund time. In the early days in GVSL, we used to take a set of companies from one fund to another fund. Do such things happen now? Because sometimes a time horizon of 10 years may not be quite okay. Some companies which have, say, medical devices or things which really require 5 to 7 years time frame for them to actually get into marketplace and get all the appropriate permissions and everything else ready. How do you handle those situations? Do you help them to migrate from one fund to another fund, where one fund actually buys out the share of the the previous fund so that you get a window which is wider?
So, Mr. Mehta, first of all, thank you so much. You have been the genesis person to, in fact, making this happen, right? And my promise when I first talked to you was the promise of being open and very honest with everybody on the call as well. So I'm very happy to hear from you that at least I've been able to deliver on that promise. So thank you for making this happen with the iCreate team for us. Mr. Mehta, on your question of do funds co-invest in deals between investment vehicles, the technical answer is yes, right? But do they do it as a policy, or are they allowed to do it? They are actually not, right? Because every investment vehicle has a different set of investors itself, right? Which is pretty well defined, right? And the obvious question then, which I have to answer to my investors is, why would I use your money to give somebody else liquidity? Right? Only if I can make the case that you will actually make a lot more money on top of this, then their obvious answer becomes yes, right? But if they, in principle, as a fund manager, I'm never going to take a deal through them.
You can have a virtual exit, right?
No, we don't do that. So at least with 314, we have never done that, right? We only do special cases, and we have a dedicated strategic vehicle for follow-on funding, right? Even with that, for every deal, we have very clear boundary conditions where our investment committee decides on the opportunity of growth that lies ahead. Because please also understand, when you're actually entering, the new investment vehicle is entering at a much higher valuation, right? So the compounding of the returns doesn't happen in the same way. The math has to work out to deliver similar kind of returns, right? And the math does not start from when the company started for them. The math starts from when the fund entered them, and then what is the compounding result going to be. Yes, so if all of those constraints and boundary parameters do check out on a case-to-case basis, yes, there are multiple investment vehicles that investors will co-invest out of, but I wouldn't take it as a norm. Right? A lot of fund management. Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but fundamentally what you are saying is, by and large, a fund from a normal standard VC would fit into our scheme of things from an entrepreneur perspective only if we are really able to give a very clear exit, say in 7 to 8 years to a VC.
Yes, but with your permission, I would like to kind of rephrase that. The value of exit is not deterministic at the time of investment, right? Because then we are just artificially constraining the kind of value creation that all of us are.
I'm not talking about value as much as I'm talking about the time frame.
Yeah.
If my business is something which has a decent exit possibility within 7 years of the seeking of investment, then only that would be a good fit. Otherwise, somehow or other situation is not quite right. So, for example, if I'm in a medical device, I should wait until about a time where within 7 years I would be able to give a decent exit.
Right. I'll double click into that question with the example of medical devices. So exit for a different spectrum of investors can happen in two different ways. Either the company gets acquired as M&A opportunity, or a company can sell its IP as well, right? Which applies in the medical case scenario. Or the company has grown to a size where it is growth stage PEVC ready. Right? Which means a subsequent investor will come out and buy out all angel investors and existing investors, right? Because the company will not go through additional dilution, right? On the IP side, for areas like medical devices, if we have invested in healthcare companies which are binary, which are 0 to 1, which are very research driven, right? Even they have been able to create opportunity for monetization of IP in parts, right? And larger companies committing to buy that IP as soon as they are done with clinical trials, right? So that provides a very high degree of confidence of being able to do that, right? I would say that even in an industry, heavy research-led industry like medical science, right, where you're just creating new APIs, and Bugworks is one of the examples where they're creating new chemistry to be effective against superbugs, right? There has been tremendous amount of confidence grants, medical community certification that they have been able to derive, right? And companies are knocking at their door saying that when is your API going to be done, right? And they've shortened that cycle. Usually, medical research takes 11 to 12 years just to complete its normal cycle, right? They've shortened that cycle through a whole bunch of simulations, running stages in parallel, having a very supportive network, to less than 5-6 years, where their IP is already, proved out to a very large extent, right? And then it's just about going through the motions of clinically validating them, working with the right people for clinical validation, and so on and so forth. So I think a lot of those flexibilities are now possible, breaking the business down or milestones of the business down in ways that were previously not possible before.
This is clearly a subject of another conversation all by itself, because I always thought, as Madhubhai suggests, that investment is a relay race, right? Many investors come before the startup will really flower to its own full fruition. Mm-hmm. And what Madhubhai was probing at was, is there a linkage to this relay race? And you seem to suggest that by design, no. It may happen or it may not happen. And I always thought that in the world of big money, it would be by design. But I'd like to ask Professor Jaju if he has some comments. You're on mute, sir.
No, I have no comments. Thank you. I benefited by this.
Thank you.
I will take Professor Jaju's time and ask a sort of follow-on question. Are there funds which are having a longer horizon instead of 10 years, maybe 15 years or something like that?
Yes, yes and no. For example, corporate venture capital arms don't come with a time horizon, right? Because they're investing out of their balance sheet, right? So that source of capital has flexibility around the timeline, right? Are there other funds? Yes, there are several foundation-driven funds where their source of capital is also derived. There are several sovereign funds that, if they are the sources of direct capital, then that is derived, right? But Mr. Mehta, that fundamentally stems down. It's a very
Madhubhai, everybody tells me Madhubhai, so.
So Madhubhai, it depends on very much, who your investors are as a fund manager, who my investors are going to be as well, right? So for example, if I raise money from university endowments and pension funds, they have a timeline between which they need to manage their money, right? So my timeline has to be a subset of their timeline with adequate buffer, right?
Agreed.
That is how relatively I would look at it.
Kshitij, I have one final question. I'm done with my other call.
Yes,
and I think then Anupam can probably wrap it up. And again, this is lack of my understanding of the VC space in India. You know, and I know this is not how it works in the US, right? But because of the regulations of whatever might be in the Indian space, if I am partnering with you on a 10% equity ground, I wanted 10 crores. You gave me 1 crore, 10%. Am I not allowed to go to another VC and raise another 1 crore with my 10% equity without diluting you?
You are. There is no technical limitation to it as such, to be honest.
So Madhubhai, to kind of lead into your worries, his money is locked in because of how he has to manage his fund. But if you are willing to dilute yourself further and get another investor that is either a stack investor or he is a concurrent investor, there is nothing that stops you unless your term sheet is written in such a way where Kshitij says you can't do it without my permission.
No.
But if your term sheet is written that you are the controller of your 10%, and if I am bringing a greater value to the table without dilution to anyone except myself, then I can get funds at a different term, either as a stacked term or as a parallel term. So investor is not really boxed in my opinion. I mean, please correct me if I'm wrong. That's
Yeah, so
I-
a couple of things to add there, Parag, right? When you're stacking investors, you can bring in new money, but if you're bringing in the investors of the same value or roughly within a same six month time period and closing them kind of consecutively, very quickly, the rights cannot differ too much, right? That's an in principle thing that we want. All investors coming in within a defined time period should have the same rights, right? Second, the price per share, the valuation does not change between investors, right? So again, within a defined time period, if in 6 months, 3 investors are signing it at 2 month intervals each, right? The valuation should not differ significantly, right? One investor or the new incoming investor should not get benefit of any lower valuation or anything like that, right? Ideally, they should not be suffering from higher valuation as well, but there can be a time where the company has actually seen tremendous amount of growth in 6 months, right? So the promoter then has the option to say, okay, depending, because my company has performed so well, because we have performed so well, the valuation should go up, which is a fair case to make, right? So with those things, as long as you are putting everybody on equal footing, in principle, you can stack up investors within a short defined period of time, right? But doing that over years, I don't think those count as different rounds, right? And then there are different instruments, either NCDs that you might want to raise, or you might want to raise equity through an instrument called TCPS, right? All of them have different conditions and they have predefined criteria and a range of floor and cap of how they would convert and so on and so forth to make raising money easier, right? In a lot of early stage companies, Y Combinator is the best example. Too hard to determine valuation upfront. So just use a safe note, right? No valuation is required at the time that you're raising money, but you have a floor, you have a cap, and you know that within these boundary conditions is how your capital is going to be allocated.
Thank you so much. Anupam, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kshitij, Parag. This has been really very, very useful. Avni, would you like to do the honors and thank the participants and everyone?
I think you would have better words than me, but if you're given me the floor, I'll take the chance and say something. Parag, thank you so much for sitting in a completely different time zone and being there available for discussions and talks. Kshitij, thank you so much. We look forward to have more conversations and get you directly in touch with our startups so we can have more meaningful and practical conversations with them and get them to raise money. Madhubhai, Tyagiji, it's always, and Jaju sir, it's always great to have you with us, and your just 2 minutes of inputs are also amazing and they are learning for us. Anupam, you are always there. So thank you again for being available beyond your time for all of us here. And I think startups without you, all of us are nothing. So thank you so much for coming with clarity, with your questions, and putting up with me nagging you again and again with questions and details that I wanted from you. Thank you, and look forward to having more conversations like this.
It was a nice way of telling Madhu, Jaju, and myself that what we are offering is just packet of noodles. That's what you get in 2 minutes.
You know that's not what I mean, but still. Thank you everybody, and anybody who has additional questions, please feel free to write to us and we'll be happy to answer it.